When you first started out,
No, when I first started out, this is water on it. And then we kind of put on things But if you actually had a go for it, I did a line break.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is just past 1:30. We will call to order the regular meeting of the Fox Canyon Groundwater Management Agency Board of Directors. Ask everyone to please join. And Director Bennett, would you lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Bennett?
Here.
Director Aranio?
Here.
Director Craven?
Here.
Director Borchard?
Here.
Thank you. Agenda review. Jeff, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Chair. We're recommending that the first item on the agenda be postponed to the August regular meeting, and that's the only change we're suggesting.
Okay, thank you. Hearing no objection, we'll do that.
Item number 2, I'm sorry.
Item number 2.
Item number 2.
Got it. Okay, public comments. This is an opportunity for public comments. I'm sorry.
I thought an August meeting wasn't scheduled.
We do have dates right now.
31?
It would be like August 29th. And that's in consultation with the board for August 30th. We had August 31st, but we were able to get this board room on August 29th.
Okay.
And I believe that meets all their calendars.
Okay. Right.
Right now
It
it's
is
scheduled.
31st.
We got board room for the 29th. Keely doesn't know that yet. Sorry.
Okay, so
same time on the
we
29th?
need to know for our calendars. It's,
So August 29th, 1:30.
thank you.
Sorry,
And not the 31st.
not the 31st.
Thank you. Cancel that one.
Because the 31st was a special meeting. What confused me was your regular meeting.
Sorry.
Right. We don't have a regular meeting in
it's a
August.
special
It was a
meeting in
special
August.
meeting. But when you said the regular one, which would have been the 22nd, it threw me.
Yeah, my bad. That didn't the regular time.
Okay.
All right, we are moving on then to public comments. Opportunity for public comments for any matters not otherwise on today's agenda. Anyone wishing to address the board, please come forward. Seeing no one, we'll move on to any board comments. Any board comments before we proceed?
Is staff going to send out the change to August 29th? Because they sent out these meeting things on here. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on, then we have a consent agenda. There's only one item.
Move the
in minutes.
approval.
Second,
I'll second.
all in favor?
Aye.
All right, moving on then to the regular agenda. There's only the one item, item number 1.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board, Kim Loeb, GMA staff. And so this item is an opportunity to, after you've had some time to think about the discussions this morning and the special board meeting work session, to then provide more discussion, opportunity for you to provide feedback and direction to staff on the various issues we discussed, and I'll briefly go through them to just kind of summarize what we heard and what we discussed. Foolishly, what I didn't do was include the slide with the main points as I trimmed this down for this afternoon. But there were really three principal issues that were policy issues that were discussed this morning, and that was what we're calling the allocation basis or assignment, which is whether it's land-based or wellhead-based. The ramp down period to sustainable yield, what that should look like, and then what the base period should look like. What should be the range? Should be a short or a long period. We also talked about surface water, and especially Santa Clara River surface water. That I think everybody agrees that needs to be accounted for in some way, but how that's done, the details are still being worked out. And then we touched on flexibility. The Oxnard Pleasant Valley Ag Owners folks gave us some introduction to some of their ideas. They have evolved from the white paper that they submitted to us. They presented some new ideas this morning that we hadn't seen before, and which we'll need some time to digest more in terms, I think they've kind of evolved through the discussions, and so those will be interesting to review. We also looked at this schematic of water distribution, which we can come back to, and I think that helped focus everyone's discussion in terms of how water moves around and how we can measure and monitor it under the various different scenarios. And then we had these tables that we went through, the sort of the fence posts of historical versus flat acre foot per acre, the wellhead-based allocation versus the land-based allocation, a proportional ramp down versus the ramp down to flat. We looked at these examples of what it might look like. The OPV proposal was a hybrid between the two. We talked about the benefits and opportunities and obstacles of both the long, short base period and a short base period. This was not really controversial. I think we're all on the same page of using groundwater and surface water, at least Santa Clara River water, in terms of accounting for it. And then lastly, we did bring this up as there was time to talk about the flexibility. The two methods that have been discussed are the accrual method, basically carrying forward unused allocation. The borrowing, we heard this morning that OPV group has a new proposal that would do away with the borrowing. So we can discuss that and evaluate that. So I'll back up and leave it at whatever slide you would like me to leave it at here. And this is really your time to discuss this, ask staff questions if you have, and more opportunity for stakeholders to comment and hopefully give us some feedback and direction for what we need to do to move forward with continuing to develop an allocation system for the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins. And I should mention that the discussion this morning and the discussion here principally is about the sub-allocation of the agricultural portion of the sustainable yield. There has been this working agreement of 40% going to the M&I folks, and 60% to the ag pumpers. And this is really how is that 60% divided up?
Thanks, Kim. For simplicity's sake, and I guess for ease of organization, why don't we, from the board standpoint, take these one bite at a time instead of going through all 5 at the same time?
yes.
Why don't we just go one at a time? We can start with the land-based versus well-based allocation issue.
Let me just say, I just don't understand how the land base would work to start out with. I don't know how we get there in a couple of years.
You know, and I tend to agree. I know that Brian seemed to indicate that it was all very simple and can be accomplished easily, and I still don't understand that. I like the idea of a land-based allocation system, but I don't think we have sufficient infrastructure in place or sufficient data available to be able to implement that kind of system within the framework of the deadlines for the GSP. You know, I could foresee starting with a wellhead allocation system as we have for 30 years and developing the process over the next 5 years or so that we do have the infrastructure, and not just this agency's infrastructure, but infrastructure from, you know, PV and United and those other agencies responsible for delivering the water we saw, you know, that don't come through wells that are on the AMI, will be on the AMI system, and accumulating the data over that time in order to be able to develop some reliable numbers for a land-based allocation system. But I don't think we're there yet, and I don't see us getting there in the next 12 to 18 months.
Chair, could I ask Brian Mondi to come up, answer a few questions? Number one.
Oh, there he is. You guys, I didn't see him here, but there he is. By the way, while Brian's coming forward, I neglected to mention that also with us are Mike Mobley and Andy Waters, alternates to this board.
And I'm going to apologize you first off if I put you on the spot, because it's not my intention. But it seems to me that in your work with the Oxnard PV growers, you've done a lot of research about actual pumping that's gone on, and that's helped the group. It helped you put together that chart we saw with the vertical lines, and it really helped drive a lot of discussion and perhaps a lot of agreement. How far and how accurate, how far does that data go back, and how accurate do you think it is? Because we've heard that staff doesn't feel confident in the data that it owns, that, you know, there may be some difficulty in setting up land-based allocations because of being able to define it per land.
Yes. So the data that we're working with goes back to the beginning of implementation of emergency ordinance E. So the first reporting period was the second half of 2014 and first half of 2015. So we've been working with that data going forward. We have 3 complete years of IAI reporting that we've worked with that were used to create the chart that you referred to.
So, excuse me, when you say that data, that would be GMA data?
The reporting to GMA.
GMA IAI reporting?
Yes, so the GMA is able to produce from its records, its database, a spreadsheet for us that tells us for every operator that's reporting and which parcels their groups of wells have served, how much surface water was served to those groups of parcels in aggregate. And then the IA data also goes through and has irrigated acres, calculates the irrigation efficiency, allocation index based on the crops that are reported in the allowances. All that happens. So,
and excuse me again, were you able to run down any gaps in that information? Do you think you have additional information on top of that GMA information?
So we have not augmented that information. What we did, to use the term validate it loosely, we took all of the parcels that were reported and we mapped them in the geographic information system and looked for gaps. Very small number of gaps, maybe 1-2% of parcels unreported. So we have a high degree of confidence that the vast majority of the land has been reported under this system. So what we know from that reporting at an operator level, which may represent groups of parcels, we know in aggregate for a group of parcels, you have the 6 on your diagram, for example, we know how much water was reported in each of those 3 years to those 6 parcels for that account. Groundwater and surface water. So we know the total amount of water used on that land. We know which parcels, and we have data available either from their reported irrigated acreage. We can also look at aerial images to validate the irrigated area. Then from that, it's simple to identify what the water use was on a per acre basis. So one of the questions that Director Bennett had was, well, how do you determine how much each parcel is allocated to begin with? We would propose that the starting point for that would be to assume equal distribution of that water across those 6 parcels for that account. That may not be exactly how the water use was, but if the landowner that owns those 6 parcels accepts that, we move forward with that. If not, we would envision that the GMA would allow them to come in and say, no, the water use was really more on parcel number 1 and less on 5, and that would all be part of the initial setup, one time to get it all set up.
Because, directors, it seems to me that it's the starting point is the biggest contention, I think, that we hear from the users. And it just, I couldn't help but notice all the attorneys in the room at our last meeting, and it just seems to me that if in fact we have some leeway in terms of deciding what that starting point is, maybe the users have tried this and failed, but can the users not pick a number? What number kind of satisfies everybody? It's a starting point. And as long as we reach a sustainability point at the end of our 20 years, it takes into account, all are going to have to reduce, of course. Don't we eliminate the fighting about the starting point anyway?
Are you talking about a number or about which way we're giving the allocation?
No, it's about a number. It's about
Okay.
how each parcel is allocated a number, a pumping allocation.
Well, I'd point out, I appreciate the sentiment, but we started by going to the stakeholders out there on the Oxnard Plain and saying, we invite you to develop a system and come in, and if you've got a system that works, that's great. So that's what you're saying. It would be nice if they would have said, this is what our starting number is going to be, but there's disagreement amongst them. So because there's disagreement, we now, and fortunately we did, imagine if we wouldn't have started, if we would have just kept saying, well, we're going to wait for them, they would never get there and we would never meet our 2020 goal. So we said we have to come up with what we called was an interim plan at least. Sure. So there isn't what I think could happen pretty easily is if we announced we like a land-based system and this is the land-based system we're going to go to, we're going to use this allocation principle for that land-based system. But we're not ready to go there. We don't have the data to do that initial allocation. But if we told them that, and we incentivized, created some kind of incentive, said we're going with the well-based system until you get it worked out, how you're going to divide this initial start, and not try to put that, because otherwise we're going to be fighting each one of those battles with one of those landowners, whereas the well operator, PV the traditional customers of PV would work out with PV what their allocation was. Once they've got that all worked out, we could switch them to a land-based system. But it's the fact that they haven't worked it out that we're here. So for us to sit here and say, well, it'd be, it'd be nice if they worked it out, they just haven't. But if we don't weigh in on the fundamental issues of, are we going to use historical, or are we going to use, we're going to go the last 10 years, we're going to go the last 3 years, what are we going to base this on for the allocation? It seems like we've got to saw off on that. Then they might be able to divide it up. It's going to be a lot easier for, as Brian's talking, those 6 parcel owners or somebody to decide what to do with those 6 parcels once they know what formula we're going to use. So, what as Director West was saying, if we could identify what land-based policy we want, but identify we need help to get there, and we're gonna start with a well-based system until we get there. That strikes me as, in my mind, the way to try to get the best of both worlds at this point in time, an ability to have them work it out amongst themselves, the things that they have to work out, and us to give them the guidance they need so that they don't keep fighting about the same issues.
And I appreciate what you said. And I think it wraps up kind of more than just the one simple thing that I was talking about. The presence of attorneys and bills arriving on desks every month have a way of focusing the mind. But again, I'm talking strictly about the number, the starting point. Whether we call them land-based allocations or well-based allocations is another question. But it seems to me the folks who are most distressed with this program, any kind of allocation program, are those who are on the low end of the water use scale and on the high end use. And if there's some way to determine a starting point that doesn't disadvantage either of those groups, the middle majority seems to be mostly okay with either setup. I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know how to get it done. And I agree with you. We've told them to do it before, and it's not a simple thing.
Sure. But I don't think there's any way that we can not disadvantage one of those 2 groups, or I shouldn't say not disadvantage, but not have them feel like they're, I mean, you can't have both the people at the high end and the people at the low end and the people in the middle all go, it's just the nature. But
if we could, we would have done that.
But yeah, exactly what it is. But if we identify what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do the land-based system. This is how, and then let's keep it real simple. Brian's got 6 parcels under his well, 6 different parcels. Maybe they're not even all the same owners, right? But he's got 6 different parcels under his thing. And we say, you know what? We're going to do last 5 years, all right? And we're going to do last 5 years, and we're going to do the hybrid cuts, right? And we're going to do that, and we're going to calculate. We know how many acres are there. We're going to calculate that acreage. Now, that's your wellhead's allocation. Now, you work it out with your landowners on contract, and once there's an agreement, we'll switch that over to a land-based. I don't have all the details worked out there, but we've got to give them the allocation. We've got to answer the questions, what the allocation is. Once he knows what his wellhead allocation is, he can then make a more informed, have a more informed conversation. But if they don't know that yet, they can't work that out, and we'll have a lot of difficulty working that out. So does that make sense in terms? So yes, we've got to. We're not going to keep the top and the bottom. As soon as we say hybrid, the people at the top aren't going to be happy. As soon as we say proportional, the people at the bottom aren't going to be happy. So,
and the people at the top are not happy regardless of the method, I think.
Well, if we say proportional, that would be one argument. That would be one thing they'd be happy about. Let's put it that way.
Happier, sure, yeah. I guess I'm trying to talk on a before we try to nail it down based on one group likes this set of years, another group likes this set of years. We don't necessarily need to be so married to a time period or anything in that notion. If we can just somehow come to a starting point that everyone can say, okay, we're trying to be fair. It was always the idea of GMA was to avoid adjudications and to try and be equitable and fair to all the users. And maybe I'm just talking too theoretically about specifics.
I don't know how you come to the starting point
I know.
if you don't also do those other things.
Yeah.
You can't. You got to know those other things to get agreement on the starting point, I think.
And I appreciate any input anyone else has about that concept, but
David, I got a question for you, maybe clarification. In the OPV white paper, they're saying that they want to start their number at 74,000 acre feet, which is the 60,000 of the 100,000 that's being drawn, and then 14,000 acre feet a year coming off the Santa Clara River. Is that the starting number that you're referring to? Because to me, I think that's high. I think that's
I'm
artificially
saying,
high, and
whatever the number might be, what starting number, is it 80 or even 90,000, that somehow makes everybody, okay, I can start there?
Oh, that's starting. I thought you were talking about.
I'm
starting
talking more
number in terms of the
theoretical about-
allocation.
That's what I
the
thought you
starting
were
number
talking
of the
about.
ag
so did I.
pool.
Oh, I thought you were talking about the starting
what-
number
I thought you
for
were talking
each
about
piece
per
of
acre.
property.
Ultimately, it would be related to each piece of property. What's that starting number that makes everyone say, okay, I can start there? We all agree we're reducing, and maybe we eliminate this initial fight.
Okay, so you're specifically
We're still
talking
gonna
about
have
the-
to get to sustainability. We're required to get there by Sigma, right?
The more we start off with, the bigger the hole that we
And
gotta
the
fill.
steeper the drops.
Ramp down. So I offer that to you, and there's already harm out there. There's already dry wells that exist. There's already seawater intrusion that's coming in. So the higher you start that number, the bigger that, problem is that we have to catch up to later on in order to fill.
I
know-
agree. It
oh,
could mean larger, a steeper ramp.
Not only that, but the incremental amount also
Correct.
is a hole that needs to be filled.
Correct.
You're overdrawing your bank account even more to get there. I know OPV has offered, like I said, 74 in their paperwork. The analysis that GMA staff gave us at the last board meeting in our board packets doesn't have a number any higher than 70,000 when you combine surface water and agricultural pumping, no matter what time period that they pick. So I personally think 74 is a bit high.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying about trying to get a starting point. I'm looking at it also as a base and management of what we're going to have to catch up to later, and how far are we kicking that can down the road. Given the fact that we,
You know I don't like that kicking can analogy.
given that we
Be
have
careful, that
some
makes you mad.
guiding
A little
principles.
sensitive.
Yes. Can I just
He's
offer?
just pushing your button, David.
This issue of what that starting number is I think, a little bit different. I appreciate why you might want to do that,
It's
so
different than
that
that.
then we can say, oh, these all become easy. But the issue in front of us right now is, are we going to go well-based, or are we going to go land-based?
Yeah.
I'm trying to offer a way to get to land-based, given the data that we have. And when you say they would all agree, they won't all agree until we tell them what's the base period for the allocation, or how are we going to do the initial allocation, and we make those contentious issues for them. Then when it comes to the specific application of that to the land and working out the amounts, we let them work that out, and when that's ready, we convert over to a land-based system. I think that strikes me as the best way to go based on what Director West just threw out there a few moments ago.
I'll go ahead and chime in on that. I like the land-based allocation. I do think that's where we need to end up. My concern that I've heard from staff, and that I can see as trying to implement it, is the actual development of the computer program in order for it to be online and people to feed into that. That's a whole new program. It's going to take some time in order to set up and have the variables in there in order to do the practicality of the program, and then the training for the individuals out there. We know from our IAI reporting and how we got that in place when we made the switch from irrigation efficiency, that there is a long lead time in training and getting the word out in order for a new program and a new way to be put in place. I do like the land-based allocation, and I do want to see us there. I agree with Director West that I'm not sure we can get it there before January 1, 2020. So how do we bridge that gap, and how do we get from where we are today? Adaptive management, as Director or Mr. Pratt's words go. I'm not sure, I'm not clear on that. But yes, I also agree that we need to get there, and that's where we should be going to.
Yeah, it seems to me there are two principal issues with the land-based, moving to a land-based system, and one is developing that allocation. What does that allocation mean to each parcel? And while I understand that information has been developed, I don't know that it's been adequately communicated or distributed, so that if I were to ask pumpers in this room, what do you think you would get under a land-based allocation system? I don't know that anybody could answer that question. I think that's necessary. But then again, and we discussed this as well, is implementing that system. There's a lot of factors that can go into developing what a land-based allocation system looks like. Base period is just one of them, and might even be the most insignificant one of them, all things considered. But, and I gather that's what's been used heretofore, and that's all that's been used. But developing that land-based system, that allocation system, is more complicated than just looking at a base period. So, I guess I'd like to know better what work has been done, or I guess staff to ferret out with OPV, what work has been done to evaluate that land-based allocation system, what factors have gone into those individual allocations beyond just the base period, so that we can see whether those factors are complete enough. And then, develop, I guess, as well, what are the implementation steps? How do we get from where we are now, so that we have sufficient infrastructure and sufficient data and sufficient management tools to be able to work that system, whether it's next year or 5 years from now? How do we get from where we are now to where we want to be? It seems like there's a consensus to try to move to a land-based allocation system, if we have, when we have the data and when we have the infrastructure. So how do we get from here to there?
And how long will it take in a realistic estimate?
Of course. Now, having said that, any questions, comments from the board?
Could I just put in another little thing, and it's something kind of that, it was touched on by a number of the letters we received about those individuals, ag properties that are worried about being stranded with zero allocation. And just in keeping with the sense of how this agency has tried to be fair and equitable, and I think we've stated in the past our desire not to strand lands without water allocation. Could we assure those operators that whatever, we don't maybe know exactly what the system's going to look like, at least we would make the statement that we're not interested as a board in seeing any lands with zero allocation. That we would certainly take into account surface waters used, waters delivered by United, by PV, as a component of every land's allocation.
Well, I think that's been fairly clear. I mean, I certainly wouldn't have any problem proposing that as the standard, but I think we've made it clear that the allocation system is intended to address all applied water, not simply what's pumped out of the ground. So, and I think that's been reflected in both OPV's proposal, and staff has agreed, that that's appropriate as well. I'm not sure what else to tell anybody.
Well, I think that statement's important,
just that.
because we received a number of letters indicating that concern.
So, Chair?
Of course.
Council's told us, staff members, that anything we come up with, we'll have to almost certainly have a variance process for. So if there's anything that falls through the holes, it will be in front of your board.
But, I think we can all agree as a general principle that we want the allocation system to reflect, as we've said, all applied water and not strand anybody. That's not the objective of the allocation system. The allocation system is to distribute a limited resource fairly, not to leave anybody out. Agree?
Given the conversation and the fact we're going to go on to these other factors, and I think that I would suggest that we sort of build a motion here gradually, step by step, and then that way the public can respond to it after we build it through, and just that we direct staff to come back to us with a system based on temporarily wellhead-based allocation with a clear indication that our board intends to move to land-based allocation, and using the other factors that we're going to decide on here, but also will convert over when that well-based system has implemented the steps that you talked about, infrastructure, the well, are there adequate, is there adequate well monitoring, are there adequate well monitoring devices in, et cetera. They have staff work with the stakeholders to do that. And I had down here create the variance, but Mr. Pratt just identified that. But also have the variance in there so that there can be an appropriate negotiations with these people. But the wellhead operator needs to know this is not a right that they have forever, this allocation. It's something that they have to try to work with their customers to help make this transition. That'd be the first part of that.
Okay.
That's my sense.
You got that? A little wordy for a motion.
Yeah,
Okay.
you go back and say it more efficiently
How
after
about,
you.
here's
after
what I
you
had in my
describe it.
notes: to direct staff to work with stakeholders and report back to the board on how to develop and implement a land-based allocation system in the future.
I don't think that's what he said.
Read yours again,
Sure.
please.
To direct staff to work with stakeholders and then report back to the board on how to develop and then later implement a land-based allocation system in the future.
In the future, but start with a well base.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
That's what I'm not hearing in there.
Okay.
So that we
That's
start.
what I didn't hear either.
Yeah.
Okay.
So start with the well-based system.
Okay, then, I guess that's in the form of a motion. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second that.
All right, before we vote on the motion, let me open it up to the public for any comments on that. Any comments or questions anybody has about that motion? Hearing none, then we'll call for a roll call on that motion.
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Bennett?
Yes.
Director Aranio?
Yes.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Borchard?
Yes.
Let's move on then to another component of the allocation system, the discussion of the base period.
Page 2 was,
Well, I wasn't going, I had my own list, but I didn't.
you have your own list.
I have my own
Okay.
list. Sure, that should be an easy one. Why don't we do, okay, why don't we
Let's
do
do
that?
that one.
That's fine, that's fine,
I need to know this one will actually help me with the base.
that's fine. Groundwater versus surface water. Jim, you've got,
So, as we talked about this morning, in terms of groundwater and surface water versus groundwater only allocation, I think this is not a controversial issue. I think that staff, the feedback we've received from your board and certainly from the OPV stakeholders, we're not hearing from any stakeholders that say we don't need to account for surface water as well somehow within the allocation system. At this point, I think we're talking about principally Santa Clara River water. Now, I've heard your board use the term all applied water, and so that might be different than just the Santa Clara River water. We know the Santa Clara River water is coming into, is being turned out by United and being delivered to the pumping trough pipeline system by United and being delivered to the PV system by United, and so that's well measured. And we understand the principle that Santa Clara River water, if it weren't being delivered in lieu, would be recharged into the ground and become groundwater. That's not necessarily the case with other water, but that's the principal water, the largest source of surface water coming in terms of at least native water coming into the basin.
And do I understand correctly that the working plan at this point is to include an element of surface water in the allocation plan?
That's correct.
I just have questions now, because I asked a question earlier, and I'd like to have further explanation about only using this surface water and not using all surface water. And the answer was we would be rolling that water, transferring it back, right? But I'm not sure that I have that all completely focused in my head. So Canal Creek water, I don't know if people had access to state water.
Recycle water from Oxnard?
Sure. So explain to me again why we would limit ourselves only to this surface water and not all surface water.
Well, this is in terms of additional allocation. Most of those programs, at least as the way they're set up now, are basically transfer programs. It's a transfer of allocation from one entity to another. One entity receives, for instance, Oxnard recycled water, with the idea that Oxnard then gets that allocation credit to pump. So the net pumping and the net amount of water hasn't really decreased. And same with the Canal Creek.
Explain that with me for Canal Creek. Give me specific examples with Canal Creek. What do you mean by
Well,
transfer?
in terms of the Canal Creek Exchange Program, which was approved by your board, now there may be additional Canal Creek water, but this is the Canal Creek Exchange Program. And this is principally water that's coming from the Hill Canyon wastewater treatment plant in Thousand Oaks. And so Camarosa has an agreement to receive that water. They deliver that water on down to Pleasant Valley County Water District to use rather than pump out of their wells. And in exchange, Camarosa gets the one-for-one allocation to pump. So for every acre foot they deliver that Canal Creek water to PV, they get to pump an extra acre foot of what would have been PV's allocation. So it's a net exchange.
And are there transfer agreements like that for all surface water?
No, not necessarily. There may be other water coming down, especially down through the Cayugas Creek watershed that is not necessarily part of our allocation system now, or it's not something we've been tracking or necessarily aware of the measurement. Now, under the
Let me answer that question just a little differently.
Okay.
Not that we know of. So the only water that we don't do this with is the Santa Clara water. So there are already built-in allocations for those other water sources that are accounted for inside the GMA.
So if anybody in the audience knows of major transfers of surface, or major surface water sources that could be somehow skewing the base period allocations that we might choose because they were online in the past and they could come back online now, or could come back online in the future, I guess I would like to hear that today as we're trying to identify this period. That's the question I have in my head. I think we should definitely include surface water and groundwater. I just want to know whether we're limiting ourselves to a necessarily narrow surface water definition or whether we should expand that. So if somebody's got something, I'd want to hear it before we not take a final vote today. I'm talking about in the future before we adopt this. That's my only question in terms of that. Thank you very much.
Any other questions from the board? Comments from the public with respect to the inclusion of surface water in the allocation computations?
Jurgen Gramco. Including surface water in the allocation is fine, but to your question, Supervisor Bennett, you got to make sure that you don't create a double dip. And so to the extent that surface water is available and taken in place of groundwater, that unused groundwater can't create a credit And that's what's happened in the past, and we need to prevent that from happening again.
So would be your anticipation that as this effort goes forward, those credits in the past are going to disappear?
Yeah, that would be my expectation.
Is that your expectation from the other people you've been discussing this with primarily, or at least the vast majority of them?
Well, I don't discuss much with people anymore, but yeah, I think the expectation is that they're suspended indefinitely, and that really won't come back into play, if ever, until sustainable yield is reached.
But you're not aware of somebody taking a lot of surface water. So you are aware of people in the past took surface water and built up credits that way.
Yeah.
And that's going to be eliminated if we move forward here.
Well, I hopefully it will be eliminated. I bring it up so that it can
make
be
sure
the
that it
focus
is.
of some
Great.
attention.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Being that Pleasant Valley is probably the single largest taker of direct surface water deliveries, just like to say, I think, talk it up, Jürgen, we agree that that's exactly what's going to happen, and what the OPV plan says is we're trying to avoid that double dipping. He is correct. In the past, PV had a groundwater pumping allocation, and water we took off off Santa Clara River did not count against that groundwater. So we developed credits. The OPV plan presents is an all water concept that I want to make sure is clear when we say there is a carry forward component. I want to make sure the board's clear on that. You could still carry over. If PV had an allocation of 10,000 acre feet of water a year, and all 10,000, we only used 9,000 acre feet of water, and it was all surface water, we would still have the ability to carry over 1,000, if that makes sense, regardless of the source, as long as we're not exceeding the total allocation, whether it be groundwater or surface water deliveries.
And would you agree that, given that we have the transfers, but if there's some other water, the bottom line is we should be accounting for all the groundwater and all the surface water. All applied water ought to be accounted for at this point in time.
All applied water as it relates to, and I think that's where your confusion's coming in, Santa Clara River water, Canal Creek water was correctly described, and today that would count against that allocation. If we floated an iceberg in here, that water would not count against that allocation.
Because
Outside
you went to the expense of floating the iceberg here.
Right.
But any naturally delivered water, surface water that's
or that's
out
under
there,
a special project and requires an exchange would count against that allocation.
Thank you.
Anything further with respect to the inclusion of surface water?
If I could ask this question, so we have heavy rain for 3 or 4 years, and people start taking water right off of or taking surface water right out of the creek. Can they get credits then for not using their groundwater? Because not everybody's going to have access to.
Just to put that question in context, unless you have a water right on the creek, you can't take it.
You couldn't do that.
Yeah, so if your question is it just those who have the rights, like Camarosa, or that makes a difference to the answer.
So who does have those rights?
Camarosa does I believe it's the permits in Camarosa's name. Are they here today at the turnout? Oh, yeah, Tony's back there.
Tony?
Yeah.
Camarosa.
And then I
He's
know
not
that
getting
I
up
talked to Broom Ranches, and I think they have the ability to divert surface water. I talked to Alden's father at one point, but I don't know of any others that have the ability to take surface water out the creek.
So can I ask, Broom Ranch, do you have the ability to divert surface water? Heavy rains?
Alden Broom with Broom Ranches. We don't have a facility to divert water currently.
Do you have the right, but not the facility?
Yeah, riparian lands have riparian rights to surface water. They have to be exercised and perfected, but I think we're not currently diverting surface water.
But if they did get exercised in the future, should you be then allowed to get credits for not taking groundwater? If we had a number of years of heavy rain?
I think it boils down to maybe it's an iceberg. If it's being wasted to the ocean and it's not actually being put to a beneficial use and it doesn't have environmental impacts for the take, I would say that could be classified as new water. That water in addition to, what would normally be in the pool. So if someone were to go to the expense to build a facility, I think that has to be looked at by your board at the time.
And Camarosa, thank you very much. And Camarosa, if they started taking water, would they then be able to build up credits if we had heavy rains and they started taking water? I'm asking Kim first, and I'll ask Tony. Yeah, Tony, would you mind coming down?
Well, I think that we're skeptical of having a program. We do want to incentivize taking surface water, surely, and we don't want to build an allocation system that gets in the way of that. But building up credits to be used later is problematic, as we've seen in the past.
Sure.
One of the things that will...
That's good. Why don't you let me catch Tony, all right? Would you expect to get credits if you guys take more surface water during heavy rain years?
Not by taking surface water. I'd like to clarify a couple of things. First, with Jeff, is the water right that we take is owned by Thousand Oaks, but in an agreement with Thousand Oaks, we're permitted to take the water from the creek. And what we deliver to Pleasant Valley is excess water, and we don't get pumping credits. We get an allocation that for every acre foot we deliver to PV, but we only get that on delivery to PV.
All right.
And there is a cap on the allocations that we can accumulate, and it's 4,500. Historically, we've delivered 5,000 acre feet a year to PV, and there's a cap on what we can take at 4,500.
Great, thank you.
And that pumping for that is transferred to a different part of the basin that's less impacted. And so that's the basic terms of that agreement.
All right. So PV wouldn't get the credit then?
Actually, the way it is that a credit is, we retire a credit, a PV credit, and we get a pumping allocation in the other end of the basin that's in better condition. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ross.
With respect to this element, the surface water element, any direction to staff? I don't know if any is needed since they're already planning to include surface water in their allocation plan, but.
I agree with you.
I'd just like to direct them to make sure that they set it up so that we don't have the problem that we had in the past of people taking surface water and then earning credits, in an inappropriate way.
Well, I hope we have the problem someday of multiple years of heavy rain, so that becomes a problem. But until then, you're right. All right, let's move on next to base period.
So the base period, as you know, has been one of the most contentious issues in discussion. We talked this morning about the pros and cons or opportunities and obstacles for a shorter base period versus a longer base period. Shorter base period arguments are that it's most representative of the current pumping, land use patterns, cultivation practices, and whatnot. However, especially if you're looking at a short base period across just the drought years, it represents somewhat anomalous pumping because it's pumping that may be, especially some pumpers are much more, have a lot more variability in their pumping, even outside of receiving surface water in terms of the drought or not. Some have more even water uses, so that it just naturally will bias to that dry period pumping. Long base period, it averages the wet and dry years. It does, it does, depending on how long a base period it is, it could represent some changed land use over that period of time. So those are sort of the advantages and disadvantages. We have more in the table, but I think you've heard lots of arguments both ways on that. If there's anything more I can add at this point, I would.
Thank you, Ken.
I have a suggestion for base period, if I could.
Sure.
I just want to throw that out there. Number one, I appreciate that PV's done a lot of work based on the IAI, and feels like there's some numbers out there that they could work with, et cetera. I believe that we have a lot of variation that we can use. We don't have to lock everybody down to the exact same period in terms of how we're going to do this base allocation. So if we start with well-based, we'd have to figure out what is going to go to that well. And I would suggest that what could go to that well would be, the last 3 years of pumping from that well for those well operators that are going to use IAI to do the allocation. But for people like we heard today that had, during this IAI period, actually cut their pumping back by 15%. So those 20% of the IAI producers who actually cut back, I'd like to have staff help us come up with a way to not have that 15% cut come out of their base allocation. And it strikes me that that's the fairest way for us to start, in that some people's pumping actually, everybody's pumping changed because of the drought, but the people at IAI that were actually cutting back, trying not to disadvantage them for that. That strikes me. I don't have the specifics of that second half of that, but there ought to be some formula that could be used to do that. And we don't have to then calculate all the IAI. We just give the wellhead for the last 3 years. But the wellhead operators have access to the IAI, and they can use that to work out the negotiation that we would be working out later based on their usage for those 3 years, if we had more accurate data from them, or when we were able to get more accurate data. So I throw that out for the starting spot for a conversation.
So for myself, one of the principles that I've been thinking about and where I had difficulty with this morning in the conversations that came up had to do with when Sigma went into effect and what the guideline was there about when your data and when your pumping could be used. Pumping after January 1 of 2015 wasn't going to be used or considered because of the world had changed at that time.
And I just while you're on that point, I just want to ask our attorney, is that for the Sigma Basin? I mean, is that for the management agencies, or is that just for the special adjudications when there's going to be adjudications?
All that relates to is the ability to prescript the dependencies.
So we could use base years after 2014?
Depending on how you look at the allocation.
Okay. So anyway, I just wanted to.
I understand.
Thank you.
The second issue had to do with surface water and the future projections going forward. Now, obviously, as we know, over the past 3 years, we haven't had any surface water to speak of. And there's been some pluses and minuses on that, and that we actually see what is groundwater pumping in order to maintain agricultural and what's been going on in its most recent use. But if you take a look at the 5 years before Sigma, 2010 through 2014, the amount of surface water that was being diverted at that time was 12,000 acre feet. And you add that amount of water that was pumped during that period of time as what was done at 58,000 acre feet. you now have a series of numbers that match pretty closely to where a starting number that OPV wanted, and yet we have some realistic number for what was coming off the Santa Clara River and what was being used as a guideline to who got the surface water and how much of it was being used in order to go back. And that's what I think is close to what we're looking at going forward as to our conditions. And so I understand the advantages of IAI in the last 3 years. I've been a proponent of using that. And I'm kind of waffling on that one as to whether or not, I still think there is benefit for that in order to be able to set the allocations on the land basis and for what is necessary. But I'm now looking at the 5-year pre-SGMA, 2010 through 2014, as a series of numbers that we know are far enough in the back that may not have been gamed, knowing because we were already talking about this and we're already talking about overdraft and how things may have been used. It's recent enough, and the numbers are close enough in the range of what we're actually looking at is coming off the Santa Clara River and what is being pumped.
Could I ask if we go to a land-based system, how do you use those 5 years and give wellhead people directions on how we're going to a land-based system?
Well, that's where I think IAI comes into, and the fact that what we already have mapped with, as Brian was saying, with GIS as to what the usage is, that then goes to setting the percentages that's going to go to each one. So these are kind of our starting numbers, okay, as what we're going to be setting on, and then we use the existing data that we have in order to do the math across.
So if we use our example where we had Brian up here, so Brian's the wellhead operator, and we say, Brian, you've used 10,000 acre feet in the average 10,000 acre feet in that 5-year period, 2010 to 2015. So we're going to give you 10,000 acre feet. And I think we're implying that if any of those property owners end up, as he tries to deal with the private landowners there, what's their allocation? He's either going to have to try to figure out what did they use between 2010 and 2015 on their particular property, if those records exist. But if we say, we're giving you an allocation based on the IAI of those 6 properties, and you now have to work out with those 6 properties, their allocation, knowing that we're eventually going to go to that IAI number, how does he do it for 2010 to 2015 if he doesn't have that data?
We still know through our reporting as to what each wellhead extracted. PV, Brian Bondi, or whoever at that point in time is knowing who they're going to be serving to. They received receivables for that. Those records are still current enough that they got to be maintained per IRS code. They got to keep the receivables for 7 years. So they're going to be able to track back as to whereabouts that water went.
So that's not completely, if you look at this, they know where their green M's are, they know what happened there, but if people downstream shares, they don't know that. Just so you keep that in focus for conversation. And we know that instance exists.
So you're thinking in this case here, based upon what I'm talking about, parcel 5 is a black hole.
Yeah, parcel 5 would be unknown to them based on what they've been telling us. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just pointing out that they only know to the point of their turnouts where they have meters. So there are parcels downstream where their water goes that they don't know, as they've reported to us. And we've just illustrated the simplest of the schematics. When they described it to us, it got a lot more complex than this, but you can reduce it to these 6 cases.
Can I ask staff while we're on this topic? If we were going to go with a well-based system that was going to convert over to land-based, does staff think that picking the 3 years that we have IAI now makes more sense, because then the well operators have something to work with in terms of, in other words, there'll be data for parcel 5 from IAI that wouldn't exist in 2010 to 2015.
That's
So-
right, and, just generally, I'd like to answer questions directly, but on that particular question, we're just really uncomfortable with the IAI data right now. Yeah, I hope that's
Sure.
direct enough.
I realize you're uncomfortable with, which is why it's difficult for us to go that way. But the well operator can use that as the well operator is trying to work out a contractual arrangement with parcel 5.
They can use whatever they like, but that included, right?
Okay, so may not need to be IAI.
Any other questions or comments on base periods from the board? Before we
I
turn it
agree
over?
with Robert's assessment of the way we should look at it.
Dave, anything?
Without having studied the numbers, I have a hard time agreeing with it, but, conceptually, it makes a lot of sense to me. Well, what Robert described,
Yes.
his period that, according to Robert anyway, has surface water and groundwater pumping in it. And it seems to be, where we're told it seems fairly well defined. It makes a lot of sense.
All right, then we'll ask any questions or comments from the public with respect to the selection of a base period for development of the allocation system.
Lastly, it's longer than 3 and less than 12.
Steve, I want to address, I think, a question where you were going with regard to whether or not you need to use the IAI to establish the base period. And I think unequivocally no. In fact, the IAI doesn't do any better job than the historical data that we have on the wellhead. That might be a very typical COM code. All of that would be one COM code. Could be 6 owners. And what you'll see on your IAI report is a list of wells and all the water used, and a list of all the properties and the crops and all the allocation associated with that. You divide the two numbers out, and you get your 0.9, your 0.8, or whatever it is. It doesn't nowhere in that application, except on mine, which is like a book, nowhere in the actual required application will it require you to parse it out by property. Okay, it's just a sum of wells and a sum of allocations divided out. Now, imagine that you decided, okay, I'm going to go ahead and apply that because it's all so easy, right? I have IAI, my acre foot per acre is 2. It averages 2. But I'm property owner 6, and the operator came out to 2, but I know on my property it was 2.5. And so I'm like, well, wait a minute. You don't think that property owner is going to make a case that it's not 2 for him, that his allocation shouldn't be 2.5? So my point is that just because you have IAI doesn't mean you won't have the conflict at the property level. Thank you.
Do you support going to a land-based system, or do you support a well-based system? I heard Jurgen come up and say he's fine going to a land-based system.
Oh, I'm actually fine with both ways, and I agree with where the board's direction was, that I think we can get there. I feel like there's going to have to be some work. I think what will happen is that the property owners that own those wells and their associated properties, they know where that water went. And they're going to have to work that out. What you're going to be able to do is start with whatever the base period is, which we have strong opinions about. You're going to establish allocations to those wells, and then you're going to have to back them out to the properties. And I don't think you need, and frankly, IAI doesn't get you there.
You don't think you need IAI
No,
to back
that's
them out
right.
to the property? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Marty.
Playing tag team today.
Are you going to rebut what Marty just said?
Yeah,
I was just wondering that.
I think what you need to keep in mind in this base period discussion is what happens in an adjudication. And in an adjudication, I think we've we've discussed the question of prescription. And so if you have prescription, you're going to have a 5-year prescriptive window defined by the appropriators who are making the prescriptive claim. And Sigma says it's going to be prior to 2015, but it could be there any 5-year period prior. There may be a 5-year window that's better for appropriators. Maybe it's 2003 to 2007 or something. So I think it has to be at least 5 years, and I think it has to be pre-2015. And speaking of prescription, I wanted to rebut one of Rob's core positions. I'm going to give him 4 Pinocchios for this one. When you have prescription, you have a prescriptive period that the appropriators choose. They prove up their history in that prescriptive period. Overliers exercising self-help prove up their individual history in that period, and they put it in their pocket. They don't put it over here in the collective overlier pool to be redivided among overliers in some creative new scheme. That's why it's called self-help. It's not collective help. And I think that's a very, very key point. And if we can't keep our historical use and carry it forward through the process of this Sigma, then we're just asking for litigation. Thanks.
Hello, board members. My name is Hans-Peter Walter. I'm an attorney for Southland Sod Farms as well.
Excuse me, I'm having trouble hearing.
Is it not on?
There.
I'm
Speak right into it.
rarely accused of being too quiet. My name is Hans-Peter Walter. I'm an attorney for Southland Sod Farms as well. I'm relatively new to the Ventura County situation in this basin. I'm a water attorney in Sacramento. Been looking at this situation from afar. I'm glad I could come down to speak with you. I want to add one more thing. I agree with everything that's been said about the longer base period comporting with how an adjudication would play out. You guys have heard some of that. I want to add another issue to the question Director Aranio asked, and it goes to choosing that base period outside of an adjudication. A longer base period is also more defensible just from an administrative standpoint. For all the other reasons that have been discussed here, a shorter period, like in the OPV plan, has a lot of problems that even under a separate litigation question and a standard of review that would be different, if that were challenged in a groundwater sustainability plan, a 3-year period like that is less defensible because it's just less reasonable for all the other technical reasons that the table points out. Not the least of which, again, is that there's all these other statutory sections that comports more with how an adjudication a judge would determine those issues and what base period would be used. So, again, a longer base period, even if it doesn't go to an adjudication, is just more defensible because it's more reasonable and there's more evidence to support choosing that period. It's more logical.
Anyone else? I knew that was inevitable. That's okay.
Rob Saperstein, I was just waiting for the Jurgen contingent or the Gramkow contingent to finish before coming up. I have a big nose to start with, so I don't know what a Pinocchio 4 means, so I'm going to bring it back in at least to normal. Jurgen's wrong. Self-help only affects the pushback on how the prescriptive right pool versus the overruling right pool works. So he's talking about the construct, appropriators have asserted prescriptive rights, they've proved overdraft and all the predicates of prescription, and then overlying owners, both individually and in mass, have exercised their pumping rights. It's called self-help. Somehow, I'm sorry, I'm repeating what I said before, but it's the right answer. Somehow the court's job in that setting, because that would happen in a court setting, is quantify the prescriptive rights, quantify the overlying self-help rights, what they pumped, add on top of that the credit to be received from the statutory guarantee under Water Code, one section 5.2, one section 5.3, all of those that deal with supplemental water, those get added on for both sides. It's both a component for the appropriators to get credit and the overlying owners get credit to the extent they use supplemental water supplies. That guarantee was for good policy to help support State Water Project, help support Santa Clara River, those types of projects. The guarantee was you get groundwater pumping credit as though you pumped groundwater. That was the only way to make those projects work. Otherwise, why would, if you knew the landscape was you're only going to get benefit by pumping like hell, why would you ever buy a drop of surface water? That's why the legislature enacted that protection. So already out of the self-help pumpers, there is some grafting on in the calculus credit for surface water. On top of that are all of the equitable reasons that respect the correlative rights of overlying owners. Just because prescription is proved does not change the character of those correlative rights. Yes, some have pumped more than others. Yes, in that mix, particularly in our basin, some have used surface water, some have used groundwater, some in a very rare circumstance may have used almost entirely surface water in the base period. So those folks, you'd say, you didn't exercise any self-help. In Jurgen's world, they walk away with the big zero. That's not what the courts say. That's not the result that happens to equal priority right holders. So astonishing to me, Jurgen and his lawyers stand up here and say, respect the integrity of water rights, except when it hurts us. Well, that's not the way it works. What works is the correlative pool gets some credit for the self-help pumping, surface water that's been used, and somehow some respect for current and prospective needs, even in an overdrafted basin. That's the way it works.
Now, let me ask you this. Unlike any adjudication decision ever decided, and I certainly can say in this state, probably anywhere else, this agency has 30 years of data about the conditions in a managed basin. Mm-hmm. Should we ignore all that and just use the last three? Is that what the OPV plan says?
Well, when you say managed basin means you've encouraged the use of surface water. So if your hypothetical includes credit for surface water, yes. If managed basin included, there was always built into Ordinance Code 5 pre the emergency ordinance, and historical allocation that was based on pumping, but it really mimicked some of the things that I was describing. So the original Ordinance 5 did a few things for agriculture that was the equivalent of what we're requesting, which is we knew back in 1990 when Ordinance 5 was adopted, some folks had higher pumping history, some folks had lower, they wouldn't need all that they needed. Part one of the benefits that everyone received was the ability to accrue conservation credits. We're not suggesting that's the right way to go forward, but part of the way to neutralize the inevitable inequities that come from selecting any period of years to establish an allocation, you add on some components. So in 1990, what they did was add the conservation component piece. So those that could live in historical allocation and the ups and downs of variable agricultural demand were able to live off of their conservation credits. Or the fallback entirely was if you weren't properly allocated in 1990, you could always go to irrigation efficiency allowance. Or at that time, it was the irrigation efficiency. It was the fallback for all agricultural users. It was a more crude water duty factor that was applied, but agricultural users always had this correlative respect that they should get the water that they need to reasonably and beneficially use their property. In Jurgen's world, there are losers. So somehow in his weird construct of an overdrafted basin with prescription, only those folks that have pumped like hell get respect for and get an allocation for their pumping. It's both not the way that it works, and you want an adjudication, that's what you'll get, because that's not the result that will happen in court. And the reality is in this basin, let's say it again, 50% of the users in this basin used surface water, meaning they didn't fully pump and exercise, in Jurgen's view, the full self-help remedy. That's a problem. So you've got not just Jurgen and a few others in that scenario, you've got 50% of the agricultural users that are penalized for having done the right thing. So my intention was not to focus entirely on that. Brian may come up and speak to the IAI. Really, this discussion started with what's the right base period. And as I understand it, Jurgen's frustration is, I reported about 95%, which means I almost was tapped out. And anecdotally, we've heard maybe there were a few types of crops that were tapped out, meaning they would have either had to make the choice, incur a surcharge, or use a little less water than their crop required, versus those that dramatically showed efficiency. And I would argue, and I think some of the truthing that the OPV folks have done is, those that reported 50%, it's 50% number, what it means is they were highly efficient. That has more to do with the crop duty that was applied to those crops, and particularly gets quirky if you're doing a 3 months crop and then changing crop types and how the mathematics works, that some of the artifact of people showing extraordinary efficiency in the irrigation is based on the crops they've used and the way that the crop factor is applied, and not that we can't explain what happened. In fact, we can explain, and for a number of different circumstances, they were still living properly within the means of the system. And they weren't overusing water, and they weren't inaccurately reporting. The main point I really wanted to stress is there's been a tremendous amount of analysis done, and from my perspective, from the legal world perspective, it is an obligation and an opportunity for the board to look at that carefully and make a judgment about what approach has the most integrity to treat the both current and forward-looking needs of equal priority right holders in this basin, and establishing an allocation system that meets that. And from the OPV's perspective, you've got 70%, give or take, of the landowners that are endorsing a system, and I suspect that a variance process will deal with the 5 or 10% of the people that have a legitimate claim to an adjustment, and that's the way to drive policy, rather than driving policy toward the highest users that cry foul because somehow they're being disproportionately penalized. Well, if they've got a good argument, they ought to come in and make their claim, because they represent a tiny, tiny fraction of the users in the basin. Where you've got the OPV group that represents a giant variety of users, giant cross-section of uses and water use practices, the vast majority of which are surface water users that have tried to do the right thing in this basin. And they're presenting a plan to you that, but for some details that we really need to work with staff to ensure they can be implemented, it's a plan with integrity. Thank you.
Thank you. No.
Good afternoon, Steve Anderson again. Suffice it to say that we do not accept the worldview espoused by Mr. Saperstein and the OPV. We circulated a memo dated July 17th, 2017. It's that old, but it was only circulated here in the last couple of months, is my understanding, but I wrote it. And what we list there on pages 6 and 7 of that, if you look at it, and hopefully your lawyer will get a chance to look at it, is all the adjudications that have gone on in the last number of years, 10, 20, 30 years, that base the allocations given to overliers on historic use. The reason that all those cases go that direction is because that is the command of our Supreme Court. In Pasadena, in the big seminal case of Pasadena, in San Fernando, they said, thou shalt use historic use.
And if you look at it in retrospect, you might say, well, that's not fair. We could do a lot better job than that. We could think about equity. We could think about all these other prescriptions. But that's the way our courts have gone. And the reason they've gone that way is to protect property rights. And it was in their mind to protect property rights. And as I explained to you earlier, in 2000, in the seminal case of Mojave, the court had a chance to adjust its view and say, you know what, we're grown up now. We can do something that's a little bit more equitable. But they decided against that. They decided that the law of water rights priority in California is to follow the law and follow historic use and actual pumping. So I'm just going to read for you a number of the adjudications in case you want to check them out. Feel free to check them out with your lawyer. I'm happy to stand behind them. Seaside Basin, historic use. Antelope Valley, concluded in the last year and a half, historic use for overliers. Warren Valley Basin, Beaumont Basin, Upper Los Angeles River area, Mojave, San Bernardino, and the list goes on. And what's going on here is we have an effort to do something different than that. And I understand your board takes on a policymaking role and you feel like you want to be as equitable as possible. And I think you've done that today by reaching out and giving credit for that surface water. That's going to capture all the folks that came here earlier and submitted letters and said, oh, hey, we're in danger of getting zero allocation. It sounds to me like if you count that surface water in the mix, which we've acceded to under the way the water code reads, they're not going to end up with zero. That is off the table. The law has prescribed the boundaries of how far you can go, and on this issue, the boundaries are real tight. And that's good news and bad news for you. So on the one hand, you think, well, as a policymaker, I've been elected to make all these decisions. But when you think about it, what's happened here is that our legislature and our governor and our courts have prescribed the bounds for you. They've helped you. And it's a difficult thing to come up with, but that's where our courts have gone. And as I said, I personally thought the court would go the other way 18 years ago, and they did not. They stuck with the program of water rights, our historical use, self-help, individually measured, and that's the way it is. And I understand it looks like it might be unfair to some, and there's ways to do variance procedures and the like that we've talked about, but this addition of the surface water, we believe, is going to protect folks, and that's a decision that we've made to offer that up, and this board has obviously accepted that. And so I almost want to apologize for you. I represent a bunch of GMAs myself, or GSAs, I should say, and the way that we have started off all of our processes there is I've said, folks, I know you want to make all these equitable decisions, but the courts have told us we have limited discretion. And it's not like I made it up. This is just the way the law has gone, and this is the way the courts have gone. But again, I invite you to ask your own lawyer about it and not trust either me or Rob.
Steve, as a practical matter, in setting an allocation plan, how does this board determine the self-help rights of each individual pumper? How do we do that?
You do that based upon all the information that you've gathered over the last 30 years. You've been so forward-thinking and getting all that information about actual allocation and use. And granted, it sounds like it needs to be parsed out a little bit because it was done a little bit differently, and we've got this diagram that's quite confusing. But you can back into that because what you have to do initially, and I think your staff has recommended this extended TEA, is figure out what the prescriptive period is and look at everybody's records. I think you have all that information already, don't you?
How do you back out to parcel 5?
Yeah, well, you have to count their surface water use, and you have, well, it sounds like, I'm forgetting the terminology here, but you have, what's the words? You have a single report that's come in that captures maybe all 6 of those?
Yeah,
it's a combination, right?
So how do we allocate that parcel 5?
Well, isn't that a technical issue for your staff to figure out? The policy direction from this board is what's the allocation for all 6 collectives?
No, it's not. What if parcel 5 is owned by a separate individual?
Right.
And parcel 5 needs an allocation, parcel 5 needs an allocation. And I'm genuinely asking her, and there is no data. There's no data that shows in 2011 what water went from parcel 6 to parcel 5. So how do we give them an allocation?
Well, I would expect that landowner is going to come forward with all the information they have if they're at risk of not getting an allocation based upon not having the data. I don't think you need to worry about it. They're going to be scrambling and helping you out. They're not going to want to end up with something that's lower than they're deserving of. So it's just a technical issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'm not an attorney. I don't play one on TV, and I don't live in attorney land. And frankly, I get a little bit confused listening to you. Rob, it's been a long 6 months since you've been here. Again, the offer that I put on there after thinking about this, I've talked to a lot of people. I've received phone calls over the past couple months about this. And I got to admit, I've changed my mind about 3 different times. I've worked my way through this and trying to evolve into it and think about it. And I'm back at the 5-year pre-Sigma 2010 through 2014 for a couple different reasons. One, again, it comes back to what is Sigma's guidelines. I get what you have to say, but I think that is still an important point to have in place because this organization was talking about these issues before that, and IAI was already in the mix, and so there was opportunities there. 2, the amount of numbers that we're moving are very close to whereabouts we're going to be ending up as a start number that we are projecting from United. And 3, it's in the history books there with a known set. I understand we've got some holes in it, but conversely to that, this is a no-win situation. This is, and actually my notes from United was for me to shut my mouth and stay out of it because United doesn't have an opinion. But I don't do that very well. So that's my thinking. That's what I have on the table for consideration. There's no matter what, someone's ox is going to get gored on this one, and we can't. So let's fall back as to what is the most defensible, in my opinion, from what I've heard and where I think the world is going.
Is that a motion?
I will make that as a motion.
I'll second it. Now we can discuss.
Oh, sorry.
No discussion.
From director's position of defending the agency, I think most defensible sounds like a good idea.
Personally, I guess I like the symmetry of that 5-year period, with the numbers that we've been discussing. At the same time, I'm not convinced that we don't need to pay more attention to the historical use of the resource, particularly given the fact that we have the data. I'm not quite sure in defending it how you would explain that you ignored 25 years of data in favor of 5 or 3. That just seems to me to be inconsistent with what I've read, and frankly, it just doesn't make logical sense either. Borrowing your idea and Director Bennett's idea, I would like to see, what an allocation system looks like that starts with, that includes those years 2010 through 2014 and accommodates adjustments for those people that cut under Emergency Ordinance E during those years, rather than just simply a straight adjustment during those years, a straight analysis during those years.
So keep in mind, Emergency Ordinance E didn't start until 2014. So this is immediately before that and takes care of that problem.
Okay. Again, I still have that historical use question burning in the back of my head, and I'm not satisfied that we get there.
Are you saying you want to go to a longer historical period?
Yes.
What do you?
Oh, and I don't have a particular period in mind. I mean, obviously, I guess during what period of time do we have reliable data? Understanding we've got data that goes back 30 years. What's the confidence level of the data for the 10 years from 2005 to 2015, and how does that compare? If we use that longer period, how does that compare to the analysis that we get from 2010 to 2014? If ultimately the differences are marginal, then then the fuss and the concern over that, the duration of that base period is unnecessary. If there are big differences, I'd want to understand why.
Well, I guess the question I have for you is, we talked earlier, if you were talking about the sustainable yield number, I could appreciate that. But we're talking about the allocation, and if the allocation is we're trying to tie this to current beneficial use, then I'm not sure that I have a lot of confidence that what was done 20 years ago gives me, gives us a great value in terms of what is going forward going to be the beneficial use of that land as people have changed their irrigation techniques and all of those kinds of
Except I
things.
think what I'm looking for is a balance between simply a snapshot of current beneficial use and a broader perspective on historical beneficial use. It seems the OPV plan gives us that snapshot. We've heard a different perspective saying, we should look back infinitely into the past. And I'm not suggesting either. I just think that when we consider a base period, we want to basically capture the best of both worlds, both current beneficial use and historical beneficial use. To favor one while ignoring the other, I think really leaves us exposed.
And remember, it's only been the last few years that we had people install meters, and we had them install meters for a reason. So I don't know how valid those numbers from way back are.
That's why I asked the question. I don't know. That's something staff would eventually have to tell us.
Yeah.
So, not to get too far ahead, but we've done the analysis on all those base periods that you're talking about, including the three. Kim's running to get that. I'm sorry, we didn't think to have it here, but if your board wanted to take a break, we could get that queued up for you. So you can kind of see the relative impact of changing those periods.
For the benefit of the Brown Act, I just want to point out, as we're sharing information, we have to say what it is, but this is a...
I'm sorry, what I'm passing around came from last month's board packet from item number 5 that staff had. I just grabbed that page out and attached it in there. And that's what I've been referring to as the base period that I've been talking about, or the 5-year pre-Sigma period. I just handed it over.
Where they had the list of all the various different base periods that are out there. So you've already done that.
Yes, we have, and we can run it by you. So just so it's refreshed in the instance that you might be able to come to some decision today.
Instead of taking a break, I think we have other things to talk about.
I think we ought to talk about some.
We can go on, but my second choice would have been some combination of the most recent 3 years and stretching back further.
We haven't done that.
Yeah, okay, all right. I don't feel so strongly, I don't feel like I know the right answer on this, that I would object to where three members of the board are going, and I think it would allow us to move forward with the other items. So anyway, that'd be my input at this point in time.
Do we want to go on to another item
So
until he brings that back and can show it up here?
I've just been corrected. We did do that, the combination of, and that's in one of the presentations, so you will be able to see that.
All right,
Okay.
great.
So why don't we then move ahead to the ramp down discussion? Thank you, Robert.
Okay, so I'm going to suspend my motion that's currently on the floor and that's been seconded so that we can come back on it.
Thank you. Well, we'll do this without Kim's direction. Okay,
So you're going to which item?
ramp down, I think, was of the 5, there were 4 that were more critical than others. And I think ramp down was the last of those 4.
And I can give you just the brief intro. As far as we got with the group was, there were 2 proposals on the table. One was just a simple, everybody gets a proportional pro rata cut, and the other was the OPV proposal, which was sort of halfway in between the two. And really, Brian could get up and give you the OPV proposal in some detail and show you the sorts of who gets cut more, who gets added to more, I believe.
I'm going to try this. I'm not sure. In terms of ramp down period, I would like to make sure we don't strand anybody. So I don't want to take somebody down too low. So in looking at this, I think I've heard enough that the hybrid model is the one that I would lean towards. So I'll just throw that out there in case we are in agreement and move on. If not, we need to have a conversation. That's fine too.
Well, I guess my concern with the hybrid model was it seemed to, if you recall the graph, provide lots of surplus water to low water users. Instead of using the method used out in the Las Posas Basin where you created a floor and then adjusted above that floor only, the adjustments as they were applied here seemed to provide, over time, low water users with lots of surplus water while still cutting other water users. And I'm not sure that's the...
I would agree, so I think I'd like to see the chart go back up then.
Sure, yeah.
Because I didn't see that in the chart, but if that's the case, I'd be willing to look at some other option there. Is it possible to have PV's chart of the hybrid go back up?
I actually have it again. But I took the liberty of kind of holding the line so I could see it better.
So again, to get you oriented, the gray is the IAI period actual water use. The red is the hybrid. And so the question is about allocating additional water above and beyond what the low water users have been using recently. And you can see there's a small difference between the gray and the red. That's the additional water that Director West is talking about. That's just how the math plays out with the data. You can see there the impact is maybe 1/10 of an acre foot, so we're not talking about a windfall. Certainly the board could choose to have this algorithm adjusted so that the red line falls on top of the gray line, so there's no increase in allocation relative to current use. That certainly would be on the table. When we get to the very extreme end on the left-hand side where it dives down, we believe that is accounts that have some reporting errors, that's not reflective of actual use. So hopefully
Say that again when you get to where?
Those last 2 or 3 bars where you see people reported under an acre foot per acre, that's just not physically possible unless there was fallowing or something going on. So in the initial allocation setup, we know that those accounts would have to be looked at. So I would kind of ignore those last 2 or 3 bars.
So is that the excess water you're talking about there? There's some people going from 1.4 to 1.2 to 1.3 or 4.
No, it looks like they go from...
1.1 to 1.3.
Well, we're looking at the wrong thing. We're looking at what, we're looking at...
Could you show with the pointer,
We have a point.
please?
This isn't a pointer, is it?
If you hold this down for a moment, the cursor will appear.
Okay.
Because it looked to me like they're going from 1.3 to 2.1.
Okay, that'd be news to me.
And maybe I'm reading that
No,
wrong.
you're reading it back, backwards. On the left-hand side of the
Left-
screen there.
They're starting.
I see.
Trying to get there. We're talking about the difference between this gray line.
Which gray line, Brian? There's all kinds of gray lines
Somebody
out
else know how to
there.
use this.
You and my husband see colors the same, right?
Yeah.
I see a blue line, a gray line, and a red line.
So we're talking about this area.
Okay.
This is current use under the IAI last 3 years. The red line would be the hybrid endpoint. So it's this 1/10 of an acre foot additional water.
So that could you just, I just want to make sure we're clear. So the difference between, if you point at what you're calling the gray line, the difference between that line and the red line above it,
Yes.
that's the excess.
Right.
That's the growth. So nobody goes over 1.4.
Correct.
So I think the concern I heard was that the hybrid would be allocating more water to that subset of users than they've been using recently. And certainly that's how the math works out. It's about 1/10 of an acre foot per acre. And again, the board could set policy that would then override the math and have the red line follow the gray line there for that last section if that was your pleasure. The intent of the hybrid was not to allocate additional water. It's just how the math worked out.
Okay. Go with that. I'm waiting for him see if he's got it all thought out?
Yes.
Okay. Then I'll go ahead with a motion that we accept the proportional method to make, and with the caveat that there is no increase in anyone's allocation as a windfall with going with this. The hybrid. The hybrid, my bad.
The hybrid with the caveat that there's no increase to anybody's allocation.
Or windfall.
Windfall.
I want to point out this chart is based on last 3 years, and we're talking about going with 2010 to 2015 numbers. So.
No, but that's on a different vote.
What's that?
That's on a different item.
We're
We
only
changed
talking about
items,
ramp.
remember?
Right. Okay. So the ramp down would be hybrid, just using 2010 to 2015.
Yeah, if we go
numbers.
back with that, yes.
So the motion is to adopt a hybrid method with the caveat that there be no increase in allocation or windfall to any pumper? Okay. Is there a second?
I'll second. Oh, go ahead. Steve can second that.
Okay. Any more board discussion before we ask for comments from the public?
Just a little bit of just thoughts on my end. I'm in the curious or precarious position of both of these viewpoints being in my constituency base. And they both have valid logic in my mind. They've both presented reasonable cases. And though we've been focusing on the one side, the low end side, which is really important, we don't want to strand land. On the other side, if we're trying to be equitable and fair, we're also trying to look at the upper end. And maybe, in fact, we need to think about kind of this middle portion. I'm unsure what I think about that.
For better or for worse, this is, I'll say this at this point in time. I know Director Ronio mentioned about, he was directed by United to not take a position because United didn't have a position. I just want to remind everybody that once you take the seat on the board, you don't represent United anymore or anybody except everybody. You have to put a different hat on. We get reminded of that from our attorneys all the time when we say those kind of things too. So I thought I would pass it on. But we have a responsibility to do
what
what's
we
right
think
for
is
everybody.
best.
What's that?
Do what we think is best.
Any questions or comments from the public with respect to the ramp down discussion and the motion that's pending?
John Grether, Grether Farming Company. Again, I'd like to bring forth the point I made this morning. One of the critical issues is whether the 60-40 allocation would mean that everyone would have an initial cut in their amount of water. That might mean, if that's the case, then you'd probably be looking at the blue line for everyone. And for those of us who are on the low side, we would have the opposite of a windfall. We would have a very severe cut. So I think it has to be clear as to whether you're talking about these as starting point numbers, the top of the gray line, and then driving down to the target number for 20 years from now, or if you're talking about something else as a starting point.
Yeah, Director West, I'd like to suggest that I think that the board's is trying to protect that bottom to make sure that we don't go below that. So I don't know if we're comfortable with doing both, having the hybrid, but they can't go above where they were, but also putting a floor in just so that there isn't some, and have staff come back to us, because they're going to have to run these numbers on 2010 to 2015. There may be some anomalies in there that we'd need the floor for, but I don't think we want to strand anybody from, when you have this many attorneys in the room, right? You probably don't want to do that.
We'll get to the procedural stuff in a second in terms of amending the motions or whatever, but Steve, you want to?
Thank you very much, and I'm going to, in fairness, go first this time so Rob can come in after me and shoot me down. I'm not aware of any case that's done anything except proportionate. The California Supreme Court endorsed proportionate in all the big cases that I've mentioned to you before. Please inquire of your water counsel here. And the reason they did that is because you have to start with the mindset that a water right is a property right. And if the government is going to take away somebody's property right and erode it, they need to do it equally among all parties. Otherwise, you're rewarding some and hurting others unequally. That's the reason the courts have endorsed it. They go a ramp down. They go 10%, 15%, 20%, and that's the way the cases go. I can't personally think of an adjudication where that's not the standard used. I might be wrong in that. I'm sure Rob will point it out if I'm wrong, but I'm racking my brain. I can't think of one.
Can I ask you a question? What if you do proportionate and it takes somebody down below, what can be used for agriculture? And so you deny them their right to use their property for agriculture.
I understand that. I mean, obviously, I guess the contrary is if you do something disproportionate, is it a taking, right? So if you count for surface water, as this board's already endorsed, and you count for groundwater pumping, we shouldn't get that far. But obviously, if you do get that far, there's the possibility, provided your allocation plan provides for it, of transferring water, coming up with lower use crops, moving that water to other parcels that you own where you can fully grow something else, and maybe you fallow a little bit. That's the way it's historically gone, and
But we could be doing a takings of somebody's property.
No, I think you're doing a takings if you do something other than proportional, because then you're making some people shoulder more of the burden than others. That's the argument you'd get from people that you ramp down more than other folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just going to give you a kind of a conceptual.
Could you speak into the mic?
Martin Gramco, Southland Sod. Just quickly, as you think about this, and aside from the legal, the blue and the red lines are the difference between the proportional, blue being proportional, and the red line being the hybrid. And in that triangle to the right, between the blue and the red, is the water, is the additional cut that everybody to the right is taking. And in that triangle to the left, between the blue and the red, is where that water is moving. Okay? That's what you should be looking at there. So we focused, Chair West wanted to talk about the little triangle far left, which is the little guy, but where water use actually went up, right? And in your motion, you decided you weren't going to allow that. I get it. But just look at it in the bigger picture, where everybody to the right of the middle is giving up water to everybody to the left. So is equity about your end point, or is equity about your share of the burden? How do you define equity? I define equity as my share of the burden, which is a proportionate approach. That would be the blue line. The flatliners are the dashed line. Equity there is end point. That dashed line, right, at 1.75. That's dashed. The red line is the halfway point between my definition of equity and the person that decides it's dashed. And you have the policy. That's your decision. Obviously, there's the legal perspective, but just kind of wanted to make sure that you kind of understood, I think, the policy-wise, what you're saying to us, and that you're saying basically in this motion that all of you to the right get to move your water to all of those on the left.
branches again.
You bring it up, please.
Oh, sorry. We spent a lot of time staring at this graph in our group, so you've heard some of the opinions. I think the point I'd like to make is that you see that we have a lot of the same crop being grown in that middle. You may have a grower that's farming row crops or farming a crop of celery with 2 acre-feet per acre, and you may have a grower right next to him farming celery on the same acre using 2.5. Maybe they've adopted different technology. And so what we've tried to do is recognize that there's differences in the farming practice embedded in that curve. And we talk about, and the reason why we rationalize on the acre-foot per acre is, that is a relative use. You want to accommodate that. The law has statutory protection for people that have invested in conservation practices or better technology. Those of us who operate in other basins that file reports on our water rights and use, we have to include all of those practices that we are engaged in, because there is differences. And I think the even burden argument, you've got flexibility in use on the Oxnard Plain. One year you may be growing row crops and berries, and next year you may be doing a sod planting. So that flexibility is much greater on the high end than it is on the low end. So when you look at this and you say, well, the water's being transferred, I think there's the water, you have to take into account what's been done on the ground, what practices have been employed, whether the cropping pattern is changing, and what's the relative flexibility that the high water user has versus the low water. Those are my comments.
Hopefully this is near the last time. Good afternoon again.
2 minutes.
Fundamentally, Steve is right in concept. The law protects a property right in water. Where he is being dishonest is the property right is a correlative right. That means equal priority. Doesn't matter what you used in the past. In a normal circumstance, even in a shortage situation, every property owner has an equal access to reasonably and beneficially use that water supply. So the water supplier last year that used 4 acre-foot per acre, if there's a requirement to create reductions, has to give back to the pool. That's part and parcel of the nature of a correlative right. As asinine as California law is, that is the law. That's the property interest. The overlay that this board is challenged to do is put some limits on those rights, and in an adjudicatory setting, that happens. What is also dishonest about what Steve said is the formula is not pro rata. And in every one of those cases, in the end, there was a stipulation about how the allocation was going to be put into place. And so each of those cases are very fact-dependent. I obviously, in my 2 minutes, don't have the time to describe to you why it was done the way that it was done. But the fundamental nature of the property right is it breathes. And somehow the courts and your body has to respect the breathing nature. Steve has waved his hands about Mojave. Here's the primary quote about Mojave that's applicable to allocating among the correlative right holders. The Supreme Court recognized that the trial court's power to enforce an equitable solution, not a purely property rights-driven solution, even if all parties don't agree, but cautioned against unreasonably burdening any party. So there's a reasonableness factor in all of this. A trial court may impose a physical solution to achieve a practical allocation of water to competing interests. And I come back to the point that you have correlative right holders, despite what their self-help pumping was, that still hold equal priority rights to water. So what I can't answer you is what your personal feeling may be about which of these 2 or 3 approaches feels to you about what is fair, I can tell you, you're not in jeopardy of somebody making the claim and winning the claim are two different things. Unfortunately, any knucklehead can walk into the courthouse and file a lawsuit. What you're worried about is assessing the risk of them winning the lawsuit. And I can tell you, each of these approaches can be justified to some extent. They don't impede on the correlative property right. What you're hearing, again, from the vast majority of the agricultural pumpers who have to live this day in and day out, the hybrid approach respects their expectations about their property rights, and you're hearing from one farmer who lives on the top end of the curve, the higher end of the allocation, complaining somehow that they're being hurt. They're suffering in the same way that everybody's got to give back to the basin. And in fact, the one property owner you're hearing from has never used surface water in the period of time that you're looking at, has never given back to the basin, and that's a little bit inequitable given the comparison to the other folks that are struggling to make ends meet in the center band and then the lower band of this reduction allocation quandary.
You know, the OPV folks have over and over again tried to characterize me as our operation as some huge water user, some anomaly of excess water use. Rob characterizes us at the very, very top end of this. We are not. We're about halfway between the midpoint and the very end. So I'm not the giant water user. We use the same amount of water as a typical vegetable grower. I'm just about doing this in the way that the law prescribes. And the law, every case I've understood, does it proportionately, and the proportionate cutbacks are in hard numbers. They're more cut against the higher user. So 10% of a 3 acre-foot user is 3/10. 10% of a 1 acre-foot user is 1/10. So you're already getting more of a cutback through the proportional use. The hybrid introduces this transfer concept. And I just don't see any rationale that supports taking water from one group and moving it to another group in the context of the legal framework that water rights have developed.
Hello, Hans-Peter Walter once again. Since we all get one chance per agenda item, I thought I would come up to defend my colleague Steve. I don't think he's being dishonest at all. I think a fundamental issue and the point that's kind of being glossed over by Mr. Saperstein is you only get to the 60-40 split through a prescriptive right self-help concept. And there's been some statements that that's not clear or it's undetermined. I think everybody in the room understands that this basin's been overdrafted for many, many years. There are many municipalities, and indeed there are issues of prescription and self-help. And so when Mr. Saperstein comes up and there's been other people citing this Tehachapi case, that case only involves overlying groundwater users and applies the correlative sharing principles among overlying groundwater users, just like riparian surface rights. But that's not the situation here. Everybody gets to the ag pool through self-help. Hopefully an adjudication doesn't have to determine that, but that's how anybody's going to get there. Every individual person would have to show what they pumped. And when you get out of that and prove your self-help, the proportional reduction is the defensible method, and the method that many, many courts, like Steve has said, in more complicated prescriptive right self-help situations, that's the method that's been applied because that is the most fair method and the most defensible. The discussions about reasonable use, beneficial use, and doing equity raise a whole host of additional, very complicated, almost Pandora box issues where, quite honestly, if you wanted to go down that path from a legal perspective, You might need to individually have a hearing on every single water user to determine exactly what they're doing with the water and make an individual determination of each one. And again, if you want to go down that way, you can, but there's an attempt here to make a broad brush stroke and paint various people on different ends of this spectrum as reasonable, not reasonable, this is fair, this is not fair. And the facts just aren't there to make those determinations about anybody. So that's why our team, so to speak, has reverted back to when faced with very complicated decisions, and SGMA is a very new statute. One of the safest places to be is just follow the 150 years worth of California water law, apply those principles, and stay within, as Steve says, the fence posts. People can have debates about whether you want to chart a new path in California water law, but every new path that someone has tried to chart in California water law has probably been tested in the courts to figure out if that's the new way that the state wants to go. And so again, that seems like a more risky and adventurous approach to take than just sticking with this concept of proportionate reduction. And again, the correlative rights, it's a fantasy that everybody is equal and that the pass pumping, and again, there may have been some surface in lieu use. There are statutes involved. There were papers that needed to be filed for that. I don't know the status of every owner and what they've done to get that in lieu credit for groundwater pumping. But that, again, is the law is clear. The law is clear on all of this. And so, again, we would urge you to just consult the law. It may be too early to vote on a particular approach, again, especially if it's the hybrid approach. So the last thing I'll say is the flat line has no basis really in law. And so the hybrid approach is a option between what many legal precedents have chosen and kind of a paper tiger or straw man, a flat line that I'm not aware of any case that's chosen that approach.
So hi, I'm Terry Farrow. I'm a grower in OPV and also on the OPV board. Just wanted to make a statement about everything that's happened today and everything that maybe has happened in the last 2 or 3 years. When OPV got together, okay, it was under the direction of let's sit in a room and fight it out now rather than sitting in a room and fighting it out with attorneys. So everything we've come up with got discussed and discussed and discussed, and some of the guys out there are pretty long-winded. So we have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to come up with something that's somewhat agreeable to everyone, okay? And some people, like, it maybe would be better for them to, personally, for my property, it'd be great if we could go back 15 or 20 years, because I was growing strawberries, okay? But that's not what we came up with, okay? We came up with our hybrid approach and, our different things that we presented today. Additionally, there's lots of talk about prescription out here, and I am not an attorney, but I think prescription is decided by a court. Is that correct? Attorneys, you can behind me, raise your hand. And when we had the meeting this morning, the potential prescriptors in our basin came up here and supported our plan. I think we heard from the city of Ventura, city of Oxnard, Wainimi, somebody else. There were 4 or 5 people. They came up and they said, we'll support this. And I think that means something. So if we have a majority of landowners who got together and decided we want to do this, and we get our M&I people, we get together with them. Once again, long discussions. Jeff helped us get to that point, okay? But it's all been very cooperative in some ways, okay? And I don't think you can discount that at all. And I don't think as well, if we had come up with something super unreasonable, like, okay, we're all just going to take 5 acre-feet per acre and boom, we've all decided that. That is not what happened, okay? We've all taken hits. We all know there's going to be a problem, and we've all kind of come to reasonable conclusions. Lots of time, lots of money, and I think that you can't discount that at all, just because something happened in a stipulated judgment in a courtroom pre-SIGMA. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Now, going back to, let me restate what I think the motion looks like after all of our conversation on the ramp down issue, and that is to direct staff to do an analysis of the hybrid method as proposed by OPV using the 2010 to 2014 numbers, with the caveat that there be no increase or windfall to any pumper with a floor to protect low water users. Is that accurate? If that's the motion, then is there a second?
I think I second.
Second, okay, so now we need
I just want to ask one question, just an attempt to deal with somewhat with the issue of the transfer of water. I just wonder if there's some limit to how much we would let somebody's water grow, if we would ask staff to analyze that. You know, how much should we have some people grow so that we're not transferring, you know, we had the one, but when I say grow, I guess they're at the gray line right now, but never mind. I've got it. It's if you go with the
Between the
Said
blue
they
and
weren't
red?
going to increase or have a windfall.
Between the proportional number, yeah, but between the proportional number, you have some people growing. I wonder if a half-acre foot or something like that becomes the maximum for the growth, and then.
Well, we're just directing them to bring it back to us.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. Do I want them to do that analysis also on
Is what you're saying is to somehow do a combination of proportional and a floor?
Well, I mean, it's just that the hybrid doesn't have the floor, but we're now talking about putting a floor into there, and it probably will, by the time you put the floor in and stuff, it may take care of itself. But there are some places where it's growing by, well, I'm trying to, maybe, well, 5/10, you get a half an acre there on a number. The spreads between the blue and the gray. That's what I'm talking about, the spreads between the blue and the gray.
Well, that's between
Yeah, that's the amount of, there's not that much spread between
the red and blue.
the red. There is close to a half, but no, never mind. It'll overly complicate it. It'll overly complicate it, and it's coming back to us.
We don't need a roll call for direction to staff, do we? No?
I would recommend it based on the level of interest and importance.
For the last three.
Have we? Okay.
Yeah.
It's too long ago for me to remember.
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Bennett?
Yes.
Director Aranio?
Yes.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Borchert?
Yes.
All right, let's turn back the clock then to the discussion of the base period that we were having when Kim went off to get some data for us.
So that presentation should be available.
So this is part of a presentation that your board saw last month. And really let's, whoop. Doesn't seem to be advancing. But I have some data from, oh, here we go. Yeah, that's actually what I want. So we did look at a variety of base periods when we came to your board last month talking about base period. And so what this chart is looking at a variety of base periods and includes Director Aranio's recommended base period, and I guess this cursor isn't going to work for me, but the 2005 to 2014, and refresh your memory on this, the green bar is, and we're just looking at ag extractions in the OPV. So the green bar is groundwater extractions. The light blue are deliveries, average annual, this is all average annual, deliveries to Pleasant Valley, and the dark blue are average annual deliveries to pumping trough pipeline system, and then the yellow marker is the average annual precipitation over that period with the inches on the right y-axis. And then I think I have individual breakdowns of each of these. I think that sounds like you're most interested in talking about. We also have at the very right is the last 3 years, the 2014 to 2017. So we can look at each of those if you'd like. I don't know if you're interested in any of the others at this time.
Just to clarify, you said Director Aranio from 2005 to 2014. I think he was talking about 2010 to 2014.
Oh, I'm sorry, you are correct. And that's the one right next to it.
And a note that while Kim was out, Director Bennett asked about something that combined the more recent with the historical. That would be the second one from the left, 2003 to 2016, which combines the T with the more recent pumping and cropping patterns.
But in answer to Director West's question earlier, there's not really a big difference between, could you go back one, please?
Yeah, sorry.
Not a big difference between the 10-year 2005, 2014 and the 2010, 2014. It's not a huge difference from this standpoint.
And can you go back one more to where you actually have it on the table?
Whoops, sorry.
There you go. And as you see there under the 5-year, the surface water deliveries are 11,800. United is projecting that will be between 12 and 14,000 going forward. So it's the closest number in order to be able to work with something that's most recent.
I do want to go on record, I mentioned it at the Operations Committee, but after having significant presentations from United about how difficult it's going to be to divert water in the future, I'm going to really need to see the data to be convinced that we should be plugging in 14,000 into our sustainable yield number from that after we had those presentations that indicated dramatic decreases in diversion in the future because of new federal regulations and stuff. So I don't want to be overcommitting to 12,000 with that.
Well, we've also committed, and then we've also heard from OPV today that they'd be looking at a 5-year true-up of any water that may be not coming off the river in order to get back into adjusting the allocations.
I also have the annual look at each of these, if that would be helpful at all for.
No, this answered my questions. Thank you. So, Robert, do you want to restate the motion? I'm not sure I recall what it was with respect to the
Well, I think we've already included it in the prior motion where we were picking the specific time period of the 5-year pre-SGMA 2010 through 2014 window.
But you withdrew that motion.
Okay, so in this case here, for deciding whether to use a short base period or a long base period, my motion is to use the base period of the 5-year pre-SGMA 2010 through 2014 as the basis for going forward and starting to work with the allocations.
And I seconded that.
But to clarify, your motion was to have staff look at that further, or was that?
That would be the accepted one to go with.
Okay.
To adopt that base period.
Yes, adopt, thank you.
And this going to come back to us with any kind of analysis?
He's saying this is it.
Yeah, I thought it was going to come back with some analysis, and then we were going to decide.
If you'd like to amend it and add that to it.
Well, this isn't the base period for sustainable yield. This is the base period for the allocation
Starting
process.
point.
And it seems like that's a big enough deal. I just would, what does that do to the allocation process? I mean.
So there's a bunch of analysis that Kim has associated with these base periods. I'm not sure what additional analysis you'd want us to bring back. I mean, in the slides that Kim could go over.
If we adopt this, what does this do to the ramp down?
Oh, so I thought that was a separate issue, right? So you want the ramp down with this base period?
No, that's part of what that last motion was, to analyze the ramp down with this base period.
That was analyzing that, but this would be the base period.
My own sense is just, it's a big time decision, and I don't, unless there's a compelling reason, I wouldn't see, I'm willing to support the motion to direct staff to do this.
Sometime we have to start making real decisions so they know where to go.
Sure. And you can always say sometimes when you make a decision that's going to lock you in, you know, you want to make sure you've thought it through. So either way, but you can make your motion any way you want to make your motion.
I, for one, would like to see a similar chart like what the OPV folks did with these
using 2010 to 2014.
Right.
I'm okay with that.
So direct staff to come back with?
Direct staff to come back to answer the questions that Dave has presented and seeing how this impacts that.
Okay.
Ramp down.
I'll amend the second.
My intention, I can live with this. I just would like to make sure that we've sort of vetted it through carefully as we do this.
So if I understood correctly, the motion is to direct staff to return with an analysis of the impact of using 2010 to 2014 as the allocation base period?
Yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, is the data good data for that? We talk about how there weren't meters on everything, and, you know, I'd like to make sure staff has vetted that just like we've been vetting the IAI thing, for example. So anything that they see in terms of input for us in terms of that.
Just to be clear, do you want us, the way it sounds is you want to take a look at it after this base period is applied, and then you may make some other decisions. Would you like us to look at the ramp down with those other base periods as well?
Which other base period? I mean, all the ones listed here?
All of them, no.
No, I'm not asking you to.
All right.
I'm not asking you to do that work. I'm asking you to vet this, and if you, I just want to be able to sort of have it, you know, vet it. If you find some problem with this, I'm not planning on raising a major objection to this, but I also want to have enough time that you guys looked at it and went, hey, if there's a problem, let us know.
Got it.
All right, moving on, the last item on.
We need to vote on this?
Oh, yes, we do need to vote on the motion, you're right. I guess, so the motion is to direct staff to return with an analysis of the impact of using the 2010 to 2014 as the allocation base period. And there's a second, so we need a roll call, please.
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Bennett?
Yes.
Director Aranio?
Yes.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Borchert?
Yes.
The last item on the list for discussion is the issue of flexibility. I think we've heard that where originally, when this was proposed, the flexibility options spoke to both accrual or a borrowing, and from everything I've heard, it sounds like borrowing is off the table and accrual is the proposed option at this point. Do I understand that correctly?
I'll make that motion.
I'd second it. I'd like to just make sure that as we talk about accrual, particularly when we're above our sustainable yield number, so we come up with a sustainable yield number, whatever that is, and we're up here, people are going to be accruing, but we have to find ways to extinguish those as we come down so that we don't get to 20 years down the road and people have accrued
Have a huge liability outstanding.
and then they can go over. So
That's the one.
I'm going to withdraw my motion.
I don't have, what I'd like to see, and don't have yet, I mean, if we're focused on accrual as the preferred
flexibility
option for flexibility, is, you know, what would the accrual plan be? What would its limits be?
Right.
How would it apply?
Right.
And we need a cap.
And we need a cap. Right. So that, anyway, just direct staff to be sensitive to those issues as they bring this back.
And there are two kinds of caps. You can have a time cap, 5 years, rolling and they fall off, or you can have a number of, I guess they're not going to be credits, but whatever they are, you can have a maximum limit on that. So I don't know how that would work.
Which is one more reason why I think it's probably healthy for us to have all of these be, staff bring it back so we have a comprehensive thing rather than we've locked one part of it down. But staff obviously needs to do some detailed work on this.
So then do we have a motion to direct staff to return with a flexibility plan, including caps and options?
Using the accrual method.
Using the accrual method.
Right.
And I'll make that motion. It would not be including borrowing.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Chair West,
Yes.
Director Bennett,
Yes.
Director Aranio,
Yes.
Director Craven,
Yes.
Director Borcher.
Yes.
I'm going through the list. I think we've touched all the bases here. Kim, anything further?
I think your board has covered a lot of ground today and given staff some things to do before the next meeting to come back and hopefully, have the analysis that will enable your board to make the hard decisions that you need to make, move forward.
Thank you. Next, we have need a motion to receive and file the executive officer's report.
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
We're adjourned, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Yep. Oh,
I'd like to invite all of you to come to my council meeting.
The
It's at 2
flexibility
a.m.
issue,
now.
you guys, we didn't get a chance to even comment on the flexibility issue. You need to allow people to borrow at least for a year. You'll get savings that way. And you don't want to put a cap on accrual because that's the incentive for people to save. If I want to save water, I want to be able to accrue it. If I know that I'm going to lose my accrual, why would I care? And at the end of the year, when I overpump, I have an option. At this point, you've said I can't borrow. So what I get to do is pay you a fee. How does that affect the basin? If you said to me, well, maybe you could borrow it and reduce your production next year. So we'll take it out of next year's allocation so you can effectively actually reduce your pumping. But what you have said to me is, you don't have an option to make a change. Just give me the money. The water's been pumped. Go do it again.
Go to the market.
Right.
Buy it from the market.
Well, if the water's not there, then I don't think it's going to be there, Robert. I really don't, especially after a couple of years. When the water isn't there and we have overpumped our allocation, if you give me an opportunity to reduce next year, because I'm a grower, I'm planning ahead. What the weather does to me and the water I need, given the crop I plan for, that is what it is. I have to do what I have to do. And I'm as efficient as anybody in here. I know what it takes to grow. Now, when I get stuck in that box where the weather is, I've got east winds blowing out of the east like crazy, and I'm pumping water like crazy, and now I've overpumped because the weather forced me to, not because I've just done the wrong thing. At least, if I could borrow from next year's allocation, sure, I'm going to go try to get it from the market. That's the first place I'm going to go. If I can't do that because it's not there, then I'm going to want to say, look, I'm going to have to reduce acres. I'm going to have to fallow some ground next year to pay this back. That's better for the basin. That's where I'm trying. That's why I want to. You got to let me talk to this one because from a policy perspective, I think you missed something on that vote.
Marty, what about all the credits that got built up when you were saying don't put a cap on accrual?
So the credits that got built were built under a flawed system, right? We all know what the flaws are. We don't need to go over that again. In this particular case, we are starting at a relatively recent history, whether it's 3 years or 5 years prior to Sigma or even 10 years. This is a point now we are all at our efficiency spot. We've included surface water, so we know what's applied. The reason the credits were there before was there was no surface water. People got surface water. You had touched on that point, Steve.
Okay.
The point is that's not going to happen now. Okay, we're going to be, and maybe if we start high enough, I know that there's some conversations about starting high. So maybe in the first few years, you're going to save some water, but and accrue it. By gosh, why would I want to cap that? I want to really try to save water so that I can get myself 10 years down the road. But at some point, every single one of us in this room is going to come up against that big $2,000 an acre foot fee. And that is big. That's a huge fee. And we would be better off, it would be better for agriculture and better for the basin if you said to us, look, it wasn't there in the market, we're going to let you go ahead and borrow for a year, just a year. So I can readjust next year. I can do that. Most of us are planning about 12 months out, and that's, sorry guys.
Chair, I know we adjourned the meeting, but, could I ask that we revisit the borrowing concept next meeting? Because that is one scenario that actually makes sense.
So,
there are some limits on it.
Yeah, so what we'll do, based on your board's direction, is convene the stakeholders and bring you back the full picture so that you can.
Okay. Thank you. We're adjourned now.